put into your lemonade, right? It's not obvious that the average preference for sugar is more similar to the average preference of people who might not buy the lemonade versus the people who might buy lemonade from your competitor, right? It all depends on, whether this is the main way you're differentiated or not. It could be the people who are definitely going to buy lemonade really like their lemonade sweet. Those people might switch to your competitor, but they're never going to stop buying lemonade. So competition with them is going to drive you to cater to those people's preferences. That could be good. On the other hand, if people who are thinking about not buying lemonade at all are more similar to the average purchaser, then competition is going to be bad. So it all depends on which group of marginal consumers is more representative of the average consumer. So while the hoteling model offers sort of an interesting first way to think about these things, it misses part of the story, which has to do with who are the different marginal consumers you're catering to. Okay, so we phrase the hoteling model in terms of competition to sell, but you can also apply it to contexts where we're not actually making sales, as long as you want to get more consumers. Because you're still going to try to cater to the marginal rather than to the average. And a particularly salient case of this is political parties, which need to win elections, and so they need to win enough votes. Imagine that there's like a one-dimensional political spectrum from left to right, and parties position themselves from left to right. In some countries, there are other axes of political, things, not left to right, but maybe how much we spend on the military versus how much we spend on domestic programs or something like that. So voters can vote for the party that's closest to their position, and everyone is going to vote. It's just a question of who they're going to vote for. Let's imagine that. And there's only two political parties. Then hotelling's logic is going to extend very directly. So in particular, we get what's called the median voter theorem. Both political parties in this simple model will adopt the position of the median voter, the voter who has an equal number of voters to their left and to their right on the political spectrum. This is, in some sense, the most fundamental result in all of political science. And it also matches a lot of conventional wisdom, which is that parties run to the center in order to try to win the election, right? But it's obviously skewed by the Electoral College. One implication of this is that in more competitive political systems, the parties are more in the center. So if a president is just dominant and very powerful and very popular, he doesn't need to run to the center. He can just do whatever he wants to do. Whereas if he's facing a lot of competition, he's forced to run to the center. And so dictatorships are often more extreme than democracies are in the policies they adopt. Also, multi-party systems are going to be less subservient to median voters than party systems for the reasons that David was pointing out about there being lots of different. Yeah, Eric.
Wait, so you say multi-party systems are essentially less dependent on the center?
Yeah.
But then it says more competition means more people are at the center?
Yeah.
Doesn't competition imply additional parties?
Not necessarily. I mean, you could have multiple parties, but one party could be dominant and not be afraid of losing voters to the other ones. Or you could have two parties, but each one is everyone's a swing voter. Everyone's in between. So it's more an issue of whether people are willing to switch between them rather than an issue of how many there are.
So essentially there's a factor besides simply where they are on the political spectrum.
Yeah, sure. So this is all very simplified, but there's a much more general principle in this, which is just the things coming out of the Spence model. So what factors, David King, do you think are missing from this way of thinking about things?
So some things that are...
What are some of the important features of the political world which were ruled out in the way we phrase things?
Well, I guess maybe we're sort of looking at a static situation. So if we consider two political parties, we would think that after primaries, each candidate would want to move towards the center. But maybe there's sort of a transaction costs of doing so. So they might
Yeah.
lose voters because they're flip-flopping or because voter preferences are, like more complicated than just simply like the current ideological position of the candidate.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that you just suggested was that they don't have to just be left versus right, right?
Yeah.
The political spectrum is more complicated than that, right?
So maybe it's difficult to determine where the center is, or
Yeah, so that's one thing. Another thing is, we assume that everyone votes in this model, right? But that's not really true, right? Lots of people stay home and don't vote, right?
Yeah.
And both of those make a big difference. So voters, yeah, go ahead.
Doesn't this model also depend on single peak preferences? So if a
Yeah.
person may prefer two different stores, then that kind of messes things up as well.
Well, I mean, I think in the political spectrum, it's pretty reasonable to think that from a left to right perspective, it's not like left-wing people would prefer an insanely right-wing guy over just a slightly right-wing guy. But what is true is that voters are heterogeneous in multiple dimensions, right? And that is, there's many different parts of the political spectrum. There's not just left versus right, and you need to get people to actually turn out to vote. And this shows us how to extend Spence's logic to this case. So think about, in general, you have to cater not to the median voter, but to swing voters. And there's lots of different types of swing voters. So in fact, swing voters can be as different from one another as the left and the right are different from one another. So a classic definition of two types of swing voters in the US political spectrum are what are called sensible centrists, which probably include a lot of you guys. They're sort of like upper middle class people who are like economically conservative but socially liberal. They support gay rights and immigration and stuff like that, but they want lower taxes. And what are called the radical middle people, who like support higher taxes, less free trade, but also are very socially conservative and against abortion, against immigration, etc. And those people are like polar apart from one another, right? But both of them can be swing voters between the traditional political parties on the left and the right. And so different policies target different groups. You can't really please both of these groups at the same time. So there's no like one median voter to go after. And so the core of political strategy is almost always trying to identify different groups of swing voters to try to target, right? And that's exactly what Spence's analysis would tell us, right? Parties also have to worry about their voters turning out to vote. So in 2004, Bush did not run to the center. Bush tried to get all of the evangelicals to turn out to vote. And part of that he did by doing get out the vote, but he also took some relatively extreme positions to try to make sure that the people who might not vote actually came out to vote, right? And so this is constantly a debate within political parties. Should I cater to my base to make sure they all turn out to vote and don't get disaffected? Or should I try to run to the center? So in some sense, much of political science is just an application of this sort of Spence-type logic. Okay, another application of the Hotelling model was done by two professors here, Jesse Shapiro and Matthew Jenskow, who looked at media slant. So they looked at local monopoly newspapers in the United States throughout the country and said that these were on a single dimension, how politically left-wing or right-wing they are. And how did they measure that? Well, they had a really clever idea, which was they looked up the congressional record, and they found words that Republicans use a lot more than Democrats, and words that Democrats use a lot more than Republicans. By just like reading into a computer every speech made by a Republican and a Democrat and running a statistical model on it. So Republicans use the word death tax and illegal aliens a lot more than Democrats do. And Democrats use words like poor people, workers' rights, and tax breaks a lot more than Republicans do, right? And then they rated every newspaper on the basis of how much it used the words that Republicans like and how much they used the words that Democrats like. And this allowed them to construct an index of political bias for every major local newspaper in the United States. And then what they did is they took each of these local newspapers areas, and they broke them into little zip codes, right? And they had demographic information on the zip codes on how Republican people were in each of the areas. And they found that in the areas where the newspaper was left-wing, the Republican areas didn't read it as much. And in areas where the newspaper was right-wing, the Democratic areas didn't read it as much. And they used that to figure out like how much people respond, who are the marginal consumers, etc. And the prediction then would be that if the firm is profit maximizing, rather than just like pushing the political agenda of their editorial board, right, then in the areas where there was a lot of left-wing people, you would expect the newspaper to be left-wing. In the areas where there's a lot of right-wing people, you'd expect the newspaper to be right-wing. And that's exactly what they found. So here is the percent of the market that's Republican, and here's the slant of the newspaper. And there's a quite strong relationship, and in fact, once you control for this, the political views of the owner have no predictive power. So this was, they used to make a case for why the government shouldn't be worried about like people taking over other newspapers, reducing the diversity of political beliefs. Yeah, Matt.
Just out of curiosity, what's the R squared on this data?
I think you'd have to look it up. I think it's about 0.5. I think it's about 0.5. Okay. So in many situations, the characteristics of something are not determined by like the political slant of the newspaper, but actually by who uses the service. That is, the consumers are also the producers of the value for other consumers. So rather than referring to them as consumers, which focuses on their role in consuming the product, or as producers, as which focuses on their value creating stuff for other people, we're just going to call them all users, which is sort of a more ambiguous term, right? And when user generation of the value of a service is important, we're going to call the monopolist a platform. Sometimes these are also called two-sided markets or networks. And examples of these are like pretty omnipresent in the economy and are becoming increasingly important. So one class of these are media platforms, like newspapers, televisions, websites, right? All of these attract lots of readers so that they can sell them to advertisers, right? So what makes the service valuable to advertisers are that a lot of people are reading it. Payment platforms like credit and debit cards or PayPal are only valuable to people who accept payments if people use them to make payments. And they're only valuable to people who use them to make payments if people accept payments from that system, right? The operating systems are kind of similar. Smartphones, video games, systems, desktop operating systems are only valuable if there's lots of programs that run on them. And they're only valuable to developers of the programs if a lot of people own the operating system, right? Transaction platforms like eBay and financial markets have some people who are buying assets, some people who are selling assets, some people who are supplying liquidity to the market, some people who are using the market to hedge. So the value of the thing depends on how many people are on the market. Other examples include almost any sort of dating service, including a nightclub. Yellow pages, right, are only valuable to advertisers if a lot of people have the yellow pages. Shopping malls are somewhat similar to this, and there's many other examples. Okay. So in platforms, users both consume and they produce, right? They play these dual roles. And so that's going to lead to two different distortions of the level of their participation. One is the classic Cournot distortion, and the other is the Spence distortion that we talked about today. So in some sense, you can view the users as both playing the role of the quality and of the consumers, right? So they're going to be distorted both by the Spence distortion and by the Cournot distortion. So think about credit cards versus newspapers. In newspapers, right, I don't know how many people here are really love the New York Times, but a lot of people going to the University of Chicago are probably what you might call inframarginal readers of the New York Times. They're very loyal and dedicated